those are the people that we all should be able to agree need to be released, and we need to find a way to reach a point where that can happen. So these are men who, the task force consisted of career officials and lawyers from all the government departments, from the intelligence agencies, who have said, we have no interest in holding these men forever. So they're still held. Now, 2/3 of those men are from Yemen, and the reason that they're held is primarily because of the hysteria that greeted the arrest of a man called Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib, who tried to blow up a plane bound for Detroit on Christmas Day 2009. Actually, these mandatory military detention provisions that were inserted into the National Defense Authorization Act have come from that same hysteria that arose. And if you can recall that period, this was a man who was read his Miranda rights, was interrogated non-coercively by the FBI, and ended up a few months ago being successfully prosecuted and convicted. He spoke openly without torture being used. But there were people in high position in the United States who wanted him to be sent to Guantanamo and to be waterboarded. The same cheerleaders for torture in Guantanamo who are still amongst us and still spreading this vile and un-American and unconstitutional message. And what happened as a result of the capture of this man and this hysteria was that people demanded that prisoners were not to be released to Yemen. And actually the president bowed to that criticism, and Congress has also later imposed restrictions on the right to release prisoners. So the Yemenis are stuck, and we need to be able to say, this is not acceptable not to release anyone to Yemen that the US government doesn't want to hold because of some other unrelated incident involving a man who is Nigerian but was recruited in Yemen. That doesn't make sense. That is guilt by nationality, I think, and I think people would find that extremely unfair, and should find that extremely unfair, and we need to find a way to be able to put pressure on the government and on Congress to say, you need to stop this kind of restriction. The impositions that have been made by Congress on the release of prisoners, I think, ought to be shocking to Americans. The lawmakers have got together, with great exceptions, lawmakers have got together to insert these provisions that have said that the Defense Secretary must certify to Congress that if a prisoner is to be released to a country, then he must be able to certify that that prisoner will not be able to engage in activities against the United States. Now, I think that that's actually impossible to do. But I don't think that's even quite as bad as another twist that was added, which was lawmakers saying that the Defense Secretary must not release a prisoner, the government must not release a prisoner if there is a single alleged incident of recidivism, of somebody having returned to the battlefield or taken up any actions against the United States, from a whole country. We're back to the same issue of criminalizing the entire population of Yemen, guilt by nationality. The same thing is happening with entire countries. Now, the analogy that I use for this is, imagine, let's take the state of Colorado. Let's say that within the US domestic prison system, somebody is released from prison to Colorado and commits a crime. And then the lawmakers of this country get together and say, in future, no one must ever be released to the state of Colorado because of this one criminal. That's the analogy. That's a real analogy. And I think if that were to happen in the United States, people would understand that that was deeply unfair. But it's one of these things that has happened with the way that hysteria is built up about Guantanamo. So I think those are the really big issues about how we start to work to secure the release of prisoners. And the Yemenis, I think, is the big case, to be able to say to elected representatives, this is going to stay open forever, this prison, unless some action is taken. And there may be short-term political maneuverings that require people to not do anything about it in the short term. The short term becomes the long term. And when history one day comes to look back on this period, when it's presented in the history books that the United States government and Congress presided over a situation for years, years and years, in which people that the government didn't want to hold remained held in the prison, were not released, that's not going to go down well. That is going to be a bad legacy. But I'm trying to work out how we can get to the point to say to people with a position of power and responsibility, that legacy will be yours unless you act. When is it going to happen? Next year? The year after? 5 years? 10 years? The last 2 prisoners to leave Guantánamo left in coffins. They died there last year. The last living prisoner was released a year ago. More prisoners will die and will leave in coffins. And as it stands at the moment, no one is leaving through any other means. I'd like also to mention to people who may not know that the process of habeas corpus, which Congressman Moran mentioned, where the prisoners secured habeas corpus rights from the Supreme Court, is something that's been undermined over the last year and a half by judges here in Washington, D.C. and the Circuit Court, who have fought back against the decisions by the lower courts to release prisoners because of a lack of evidence, and for reasons that I can only describe as nakedly ideological reasons, are saying that the government doesn't really need to present anything in the way of evidence, that evidence shouldn't really be challenged, that whoever the government says is somebody that should be held should continue to be held. And what's happened in the last year and a half is that after successes for the prisoners and releases for the prisoners, the last 11 habeas corpus petitions have been lost, 5 other successful petitions have been either vacated or ruled against by the Circuit Court. It is not possible to get out of Guantánamo through legal means. After all those years of struggling, the judges of the DC Circuit Court have eliminated habeas corpus as a remedy for prisoners in Guantánamo.